Praising God and thanking Him once again. Let's call Lamentations chapter 5, the last chapter in the book. What will you do when you realize? What do you actually realize? In a chapter that I thought I understood in terms of a takeaway or a lesson, but the more I read it, verse 7 in particular leaves me confused as to whether or not they have actually learned enough from this experience. In this chapter that spends the first 5 or 6 verses talking about their loss from the perspective of their lost inheritance, asking God, first of all, in verse 1, to remember what has befallen them. They'll go on literally in verse 2 to talk about their inheritance, the loss of their homes to others, describing themselves in verse 3 as being likened to orphans, the fatherless, with their mothers wandering as widows. Verse 4 saying that their stuff is now the stuff they've got to pay for, meaning they got to pay for their own water. They got to pay for the wood that came from what was their own trees. Verse 5, describing them as now living a life that leaves them weary, giving them no rest, understanding that they are left to essentially beg for their basic needs from their neighbors, Egypt and Assyria, to get bread enough. Stating that once again in a passage that helps us understand the why in this situation. They're going to say, our fathers sinned and are no more, and we bear their iniquities. Moving on in verse 8 to say that even slaves rule over them. They now fill out the bottom in whatever society they are living in now, saying that their daily bread is something that they get in peril. And it doesn't literally say daily bread, but them describing the way that they have to hunt down bread in danger reminded me of the way that Jesus told us to simply pray to God to give us our daily bread, a prayer that's much easier to appreciate in times like this when there's no guarantee you get it, when God removes us from places of feasting. Verse 10 going on to say that their skin is like an oven, understanding that they are dealing with the heat of famine, it's described here. Verse 11 will go on to say that their security is at peril to the point where they can't protect their own women who seem to be getting assaulted in their current condition. Why? Because even their princes, their best, are filling out the bottom of this society as the young men are compelled to struggle. Likewise, the boys are staggering under the loads that they are carrying. Verse 14 talking about the places they used to take as a place of honor, or where they used to find joy. That's not even in mind anymore, where they seem to be focused on other things, survival being chief among them. Verse 15 describing the way that the old joy is just gone. Verse 16 talking about their status once again. The crown that they once appreciated as a great nation has fallen from their heads. Verse 17 saying that for this, our heart has become sick, and for these things, our eyes have grown dim. As the plane, as it were, begins its descent on not only the chapter, but the book of Lamentations, they're going to once again use a familiar term describing their situation as desolate. However, in contrast, in verse 19, it's going to say, but you, O Lord, reign forever. Your throne endures to all generations. I'll just read the last few verses, beginning of verse 20. Why do you forget us forever? Why do you forsake us for so many days? Restore us to yourself, O Lord, that we may be restored. Renew our days of old, unless you have utterly rejected us and you remain exceedingly angry with us. A conclusion, quite possibly in the form of a prayer that seems super contrite, but as I mentioned, it begs the question, what have they actually learned? Going back to verse 7, where they say their fathers have sinned and are no more, and they are bearing their iniquities, as if that generation didn't have enough iniquities of its own. Thus raising the question, what have, as once again we said, what have they really learned? A question that we can maybe look at optimistically, understanding that even though this chapter might not be filled with a bunch of their personal confessions, parts of the Lamentations that we have seen before this had what seemed to be some candid confessions of their own guilt for their own sins, iniquities, and transgressions. Positively spun, they will walk a path that embraces their own responsibility and, as we've said, their responsibility to cut baggage or cut ties with the baggage of the past and move forward in a healthy direction. However, if you know how the story ends up moving forward in books like Ezra and Nehemiah, you realize that one of the themes we touched on in those books is how both of those leaders ended up living out stories that for the most part were anticlimactic, meaning out of all the potential that they each had and all the accomplishments they were able to make in restoring Judah to becoming a nation of its own, both of those books ended with uncertainty as the nation descended back into its old habits. Thus, our title here in the Lamentations. What did they really learn? Understanding the mistakes they were about to repeat. A point that probably stands out to me because of both the degree I get tired of repeating my own mistakes and the degree to which I honestly am shocked at seeing individuals, when given a second chance, just walk back into the same mistakes. And so, since it's a problem that I can relate to, I can sometimes say my prayer for you is my prayer for me, that God willing, to the degree that he is still willing to work with us, may we ask him for the wisdom, the integrity, and the whatever it takes to not walk back into the same mistakes.